Welcome to the Very Basics podcast. My name is Paul. I am a PhD student at Yale University. And on this podcast, I sit down with experts, with everyday people, with thinkers, with writers, with teachers to talk about the Bible, to talk about society, to talk about faith, to talk about our relationship with God and the world and everything else in between. And today I have a special guest who is going to be helping us think about Pentecostalism in Africa primarily. And my special guest is Dr. Kyama Mugambi. I like to call him Professor Mugambi. Professor Mugambi teaches at Yale University Divinity School as an assistant professor of world Christianity with a focus on Africa. He used to work and teach at Africa International University in Kenya, where he was like a senior researcher and a faculty member. And his work focuses especially on ecclesial, social, cultural, theological, and epistemological themes within African urban Christianity. And that is very typified in his recent book, A Spirit of Revitalization, Urban Pentecostalism in Kenya, which, does a lot of the survey of the history of Pentecostalism in Kenya and has actually received a lot of attention from different experts and scholars and people who work in the fields of mission studies, world Christianity, and intercultural theology. If you're not in academy, all of these seems a little bit abstract, but trust me, it's all good stuff, okay? And Professor Mugambi is right here. So I'm going to go straight into the conversation and we're going to interact with him and pick his brain on what he thinks Pentecostalism is all about and what we can learn from that experience. All right. Once again, it's a pleasure for you to be here. But I guess one curiosity that many people would have who are listening to this podcast would be how did you get interested in maybe like studying Pentecostalism in the first place, right? Your first book, which is like that's right here, A Spirit of Revitalization, Urban Pentecostalism in Kenya. Great book, right? But how did you get interested in studying Pentecostalism the way you do it?
So, my background is, church ministry. So I began by being involved in church and being in I was raised up Anglican and then, moved to charismatic movement and was involved in church, was involved in the ministry, ultimately involved in pastoral work. Yeah. And I became very curious about what is this movement? What is going on in my country? What is going on in Africa?
Right.
And my, that kind of sparked an interest. And I feel a sense of dual call to both the church and to the academy, like you mentioned. And so for me, that became a subject of study. And, a little point here, a little note is that some of the material that I was reading about Pentecostalism in Africa didn't sound to me as well informed. I feel like it left a few important things. And so I felt, I think as one who's coming from within the movement in a sense, because, again, for academic study, you do need to have, kind of a critical engagement with what you're seeing.
Right.
I felt that I was able to have some vantage point to see some things and to have access to certain features that then can be brought out in academia.
Nice. I like two things here. You talked about a dual call, right? That's a very good way of expressing your sense of call. And then the second thing is like you sort of identified something that was not being done the way you wanted it to be done, where people were writing about the thing, but we're not writing it the way you were observing it and the way you were experiencing it as somebody who was working in the field. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people listening can take out, right? Because, you can have multiple calls. You have a dual call. You can have two things that you have a sense of what God is calling you to do. And maybe one of the things that leads you there is identifying problems, identifying something that is not being done. Fascinating point. But let's go to the subject itself,
Yeah.
right? And I'm sure that I love origin stories. I love talking about where things began, right?
Yeah.
So as I put here, I'm sure there's a brief version of the story of the beginnings of Pentecostalism in Africa. Obviously, right now it's probably the biggest movement, and we'll talk about it. But what is your sense of the origins of Pentecostalism in Africa? You were certainly East African, but there's also like the West African version. There's also the South African version. So, what's your sense of how the movement began?
So there are different theories out there about how Pentecostalism has grown. One theory is Pentecostalism in the form that we see it in Africa started in one place and kind of spread out, or started in Azusa Street. And spread out in Azusa Street in California and spread out through the whole world. That's one way of looking at Pentecostalism. But it looks at Pentecostalism as a very specific denomination or set of denominations that share a history.
Right.
But I think Pentecostalism is a lot more than that. Pentecostalism is a move of the Spirit, or a people of the Spirit that operate in a particular way. And so when we talk about Pentecostalism in Africa, in fact, we do need to think of Pentecostalism as something more than just a denomination or a set of denominations.
Right.
It's a way of living the Christian life.
Right.
So if we take that view and then look at the historical facts, I have become convinced, together with others, that Pentecostalism emerged in different places, in history. And some of those places, or some of the movements or the urgings started before Azusa Street.
Yeah.
And so scholars of Pentecostalism will call that a polygenetic approach, or polygenesis of Pentecostalism, starting in different multiple places around Africa and actually around the world.
Right.
And so to that extent, it started in different places. The original forms are what people have called African independent churches. I prefer to call them early African initiatives in Christianity. For this simple reason that, independence, you talk about independent churches, raises the question, independent from what? And so it's a term that has been used and, fits a certain category of terms and helps with the nomenclature. But I feel that outside of the taxonomical uses of the term, I think early African initiatives in Christianity is a bit more representative.
Right.
And so that's where it started. And in different places, like I say, East Africa had its own movement, West Africa had its own movements, Southern Africa had its own movements. South Africa had some of the earlier movements, in the 1800s and so on. So, and so those started, and then you have renewal movements from within the historic mission churches.
Right.
And this happens, through the World War era into the period just before, the struggle for independence for Africa. And then right after, you have now the start of, or the launch, the growth of what we call newer Pentecostal and charismatic movements.
Right.
And those have morphed, and there are many different kinds all over Africa. Yeah.
It's like a virus, right?
And what's unique about this is that I've talked about these historical periods and said, the early African initiative started, and then you have, kind of renewal movements, and then you have newer Pentecostal charismatic churches. What is unique is that this is not serial. It doesn't happen one, then another, then another. All of these can be found in different places in Africa now. So, one starts like the early African initiatives, you're going to find expressions of that in different parts of Africa. You're going to find what they sometimes call Zion churches, Zionist churches in Southern Africa, Aladura churches, or Harist churches in Western Africa. And then you have Spirit Roho churches in Eastern Africa. Yeah.
So, that's fascinating because even in terms of timing, that it speaks to the fact that it's not something that was brought to Africa, right? It's like it began in multiple places at different times and all these things. And there were versions of it that even existed on the continent before the Azusa Street version, sort of also started spreading on the continent. That's really great. You pointed to the second question that I had, which is Pentecostalism as a movement, as a movement versus a denomination. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about, because if I'm talking to my American friends, and I'm, identifying or describing Christianity on the continent, it's it's very difficult to do, because you could find a Presbyterian, for example, or a Methodist, for example, whose outlook and expression of faith is pretty much like the Pentecostal, right? They speak in tongues, they do all the things, right? Yeah. But they're Presbyterian. So, speak to us about like that relationship between denomination versus movement.
Yeah. And I think that is helpful. Let me preface this with a comment. Say, Christianity, one of the what Andrew Walls used to call the genius of Christianity, as Lamin Sane will call the genius of Christianity, is that Christianity has this capacity hardwired within it to incarnate into different places.
Yeah.
And that is important in understanding how we conceptualize Christianity in different places, because the way Christianity has continued to incarnate or one would say, as Andrew also say, the way Christ has incarnated in African African religious experience, is that people see religion, or people see Christianity in a way that is very different from post-Enlightenment Europe. Yeah. And that is, they live in this kind of holistic cosmology where what you see, what you can't see are somehow connected. And our religious experience articulates that reality in a very vivid way. Yeah. And Pentecostalism, or Pentecostal Christianity, is a way of, kind of fits within that cosmology, which, by the way, is not very far removed from New Testament Christianity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, they saw things that way. Yeah. And so, illness in one's body could have been, illness because of a specific thing, or it could have been because, the man born blind at birth. It could have been because, there was sin involved. Or, there could be just a variety of explanations, some of which are connected with particular, pathogens in the body, and a continuum with, on the other side, it is a spiritual problem. So what the person has is, what is manifesting as illness in a person is really a spiritual problem. And so Africans tend to see that kind of worldview. You can have that worldview. And so Pentecostals appreciate that worldview and live this worldview in very, very vivid ways. Mm-hmm. And so that way of expressing Christianity will be found, amongst people who are Presbyterians or Anglicans like myself, or some of the other denominations, even Catholicism. Yes. So that you find that there's a charismatic, a charismatic expression of Catholicism. Now, another note that I would want to add there is to kind of compound this a little and say that people then do not live out that their Christian expressions in isolation from one another. Right. And so it is not unusual to find, especially in prayer meetings, to find, the Baptists, from the church next door, the Presbyterians from the church next door, and the Catholics that you had in your house just before you came for the prayer meeting, we'll all come together to the prayer meeting, and we will experience that, spiritual moment together in prayer, because there are certain things that we understand and we see together.
Yes.
And share those experiences. And then on Sunday, people go to their different services, and they'll do the services in the way that in the liturgy that they do them. And the Pentecostals go and do their oral liturgy wherever they are. So I think those that's a way of thinking about Pentecostalism,
right?
Which is not denominational,
right? Yeah. That's truly fascinating in many, many, many ways, because it helps. Like if you go to West Africa, for example, and you're just observing this thing and you don't think about it the way you just explained it, it's like, what's going on? Like it's really new and bizarre in many ways. But this helps, like giving us the framework to think about that. Obviously, it is the fastest growing movement on the continent. Before we go to some of the trends and some of the the emphasis of activities and theology and doctrine and things like that, just help viewers and listeners appreciate how fast it is growing, right? How big is Pentecostalism right now on the continent? Yeah, so
different, there are different metrics that people would use. First of all, it's a difficult movement to quantify.
Yeah.
Because if you just look at the denominations alone, you probably be talking about 20, maybe 20%, 30% of
Christians,
the Protestant
Christians. Okay.
But you see, if you include those denominations or denominational expressions like Anglicans, Presbyterians, and who are Pentecostal, then the number might rise to maybe a third of all Christians.
That's something.
So when demographers do their demography, and a good place to go is the World Christian Encyclopedia, which you can find some of the data online. You're going to find that when they talk about Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity, they'll say, well, these numbers might likely include people from other denominations who have been counted in other denominations.
Right.
So it's growing as an expression or as a movement, a way of seeing Christians growing fast. And in terms of the rate of growth, it has the fastest rate of growth. Because if you are looking at that movement in the 1900s, early 1900s, you're looking at a very small proportion, because Africa at that point is 90 something percent primary religion.
Yes.
And then now Africa is half of Africa is Christian.
Yes.
So as a movement, Christianity is growing.
It is.
You are looking at over 630 million Africans who consider themselves Christians. But then the movement that will say, those kind of expressions of Christian are very small proportion, almost nothing, very small. But now you're looking at, maybe up to a third of the Christians, 200 something million. Wow. And so you're looking from anything less than, just a few millions to 200 million within 100 years.
Yes.
So that rate of growth is like exponential.
Really exponential.
Really exponential. And even proportionately, it's from, very small fraction of Christians to up to, maybe up to a third of the Christians, quarter to a third.
Wow. Interesting. So let's talk about maybe we should take a pause here and let me just be sure that we are on track with everything. We are. Okay, good. So far, so good. I like it. Okay, so let's talk about some of the current trends within the movement of Pentecostalism. I put here prophecy and the prophetic movement, right? It's a big thing. Church planting styles and church administration styles and things like that. You talked about it being identified as like an independent, thing. And what is it independent of? Like another version of the term is, I think I heard that in Ghana or maybe Nigeria, one man church, right? Which is like describing the system of administration. Usually it's just one person doing all of that and so on and so forth. Like the message of the good life, right? Prosperity and prosperity gospel, some of these trends. What do you think?
So let me divide those into just different components. One set of components, the ecclesiology of it. How does it? How does a thing function as a church?
Yeah.
And so there are people who would say, well, these churches can be known because of how they start. They start with a leader, and then they have, usually the leader is everything. The leader is
for sure.
He's the one, the preacher is the one who, takes the money to the bank and, if at all.
Yes.
Then, this is the person responsible for the doctrine, the person responsible for pretty much everything. Everything. So that's one common, especially for the smaller ones. But there are larger movements where you have, pastors, and then, with larger teams. And then you have others that are, movements that have, a bishop. They've, have episcopized. So that you have a bishop who is in charge of several pastors that have parishes in different places. And some of them are really large, like they are global with an overseer, and then you have regional kind of bishops and regional overseers, and you have, pastors under them, you have parishes, you have all of that. So in that sense, we can't see it in one way. That's just in terms of polity. And you can look at it in terms of church size.
Church size, right?
So that you have small, 0 to 20, 0 to 50 kind of churches. Those are very many. Urban, you find them in urban centers, you find them in rural areas. You have slightly larger ones, 50 to 200. You find them in, again, urban centers and so on. Those tend to have, the pastor, and you have, some deacons or people who serve. And then larger ones, over 200, 500, or 1,000. And when it hits 1,000, according to some metrics, they say that's a mega church.
That's a mega church. Yeah, that's a very common phrase.
So you have some that are over 1,000, which puts them in the designation of mega church. Some other people will say, well, mega churches start at 2,000. But even then, you'll find some which are, at 2,000. So that's another way of looking at them in terms of trends. You have many, many more that are smaller. But then you have some of these bigger ones as well. And so those are trends, church planting, and some of them, again, two different ways of church planting. Some of them plant churches actively, so they send out pastors and they send out people, they commission people to plant churches, and that's very effective. But then you have others that plant churches through breakups, schism. So breakaways,
churches.
Breakaways, and that's a very common, very common means or common trend. Both of those are common trends of church planting. But you can also look at the churches in terms of their theology. And so let me talk about a couple of different things. So, for example, some of them will have the classical doctrine of tongues as initial evidence of the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And so some of those are some of the churches, many of them actually, have that as a fixed doctrine.
Yeah.
And, would incorporate in their liturgy moments to pray, not just for people to be baptized, but to be baptized in the Spirit.
Yeah.
And for them, they see those as two separate events in one's own spiritual journey.
Right.
But then there are others, equally, that do not emphasize tongues as the initial evidence. The tongues are evidence, but it's not the initial evidence. And again, those, are quite a number. And for those ones, you find that they are not, for many of those, that have that kind of perspective are not very insistent on that in their preaching and so on. And then you have still others that will say, well, there's evidence of the Holy Spirit, but it doesn't have to be tongues.
Yeah.
and those are, valid, and they still fit within a kind of Pentecostal perspective or the realm. So that's one of the things. And then a common conversation about these churches is the way that they view life, or what you call the good life.
Yeah.
And for many of these churches, they have a very concrete perspective, very concrete perspective of the engagement between God, the intervention, God's intervention into our world.
Yeah.
And one of the ways in which God intervenes in our world is through power encounters.
Yeah.
Healings, deliverance, and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And the other is he intervenes in terms of provision.
Yeah.
And so for many of those have been labeled, prosperity teaching churches. And so again, a lot of the scholarship and the commentary, the public commentary, because people talk about them in the newspapers and so on.
Yeah, on radio and everywhere.
On radio and everywhere. A lot of people look, especially looking from the outside in, would say, well, these churches, they're heretical, and there is no such thing as faith healing. There is no such thing as deliverance. And so it's all a sham, and so there's that perspective, which really is informed by cosmologies that are dualist.
Yes.
People who don't see any connection. What is spiritual, you can't measure it, you can't know it.
Yeah.
If it is there, good. If it is not there, it really doesn't matter to us.
Right.
We measure what is physical,
what's here,
what we can see.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a post-enlightenment way of looking at things. And so with that lens, then obviously the whole idea of Pentecostalism is just a big sham.
Yeah. I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's on the side of the power encounters, and on the side of the provision and miraculous provision and those kinds of things. Again, there are people who come in and say, well, I think there's a problem with viewing religion in that sort of way, because it's very transactional and it's a view of religion that promotes, in some people's views, laziness. That one will not work because they're praying for and waiting for their miracle.
Yeah.
Which again, when you look at the data on the ground, a lot of these churches do talk about prayer and do talk about God's provision, but somehow hand in hand with that, they have a kind of I'm going to call it a kind of penchant for teaching about a kind of a work ethic.
Yeah.
You need to work. When you wake up in the morning, go to the office expecting your miracle.
Yeah.
Dress up. Get to the office early. And what? And so there's an interesting paradox over there. So there are encouraging people to pray and sometimes even give towards financial miracles. But on the other side, they're also encouraging people to work, start your business and believe that God is going to bless it and, that kind of thing. So they're also encouraging entrepreneurship and kind of a strong work ethic. And the two are going together kind of paradoxically.
Yeah.
But then again, in Africa, dealing with kind of those spiritual ambiguities, the cosmology allows for that kind of ambiguity, which is different in other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And so people are able to live with that kind of thing. I'm going to the office early in the morning because I'm going expecting my miracle of promotion.
Yes.
Because I prayed for it on Sunday.
I prayed.
And when it comes to, on Sunday, they're going to go and they're praying for their miracle. And, sometimes, they'll give towards
sow a seed,
They're going to sow their seed. And I think a major part of that has been misunderstood. It's because these people see a connectedness between their spiritual lives, God, and their physical lives, their work, provision, health, all of those things are all joined together.
Yes.
And so illness is not just about pathogens in your body and these things. It is also about spirits of
evil spirits,
and all of that, and I think, so those are trends,
right?
And what I want to say is the oral nature of these movements, coupled with the fact that they are, to some extent, separate from or reactionary from historic mission Christianity.
Yes.
Exposes them to error, their approach to orthodoxy.
Yeah.
And so there is what one would call heresy in those churches.
Yeah.
Yes, a lot of these churches lend themselves towards personality cults and so on. And a lot of them, there's financial impropriety, moral, failure of leaders. But I feel, in studying them, and for those who will be listening to this and want to study them, I think you need to study them within the context that they are in, and use the matrix of understanding of the way people know things, the epistemology, the way people know things, and use that as a framework with which to evaluate these movements.
Great.
It's difficult. It would be inaccurate to evaluate them with a framework for a different epistemology.
True. True. Wow, a lot of very, very good things there, because these are trends that people see. Like I feel like this is like the outward identity of Pentecostalism, right? Before you even begin to see what the internal details of the movement is, these are the things you see. Like you see people pray in tongues, you hear the message, like God is going to do it, sow a seed, God is going to heal. You see those things first. Yeah. Before you even begin to see like some of the details. And sometimes it's very tempting to limit the entire movement to these trends. And like you said, the tendency to get into error and heresy based on like, the way the movement is reactionary to like, early missionary movements and things like that is very high, and maybe we should talk a little bit about the errors and the heresies and the cults thing and the excesses and the abuses and things. I think in recent times, a lot of I've been watching a lot of Facebook, especially Facebook and Twitter is where you get all the good info. So a lot of the young people are now beginning to ask questions, where's all the money that we give to these churches going to, what about people we pray for them to be healed, but they don't get healed, prophecies that are like amiss, or prophecies that seem to control people's lives in the way of like, this is what I think this is what God is telling me to tell you to do, and you have to do it. Right. That kind of thing, sort of controlling people's lives. And people have begun to like lump sum all of those as, it's the church. Like the church is causing all these problems. And the church is doing. Can you speak to those things a little bit? How should people think about these things?
A couple of important footnotes
Yes.
before we begin.
Let's do the footnotes. Let's do it.
Let's do the footnotes. Helpful footnote number one. Helpful footnote number one. It is important to note that these errors, for anyone willing to study history, these errors are not limited to the church in Africa.
Yes.
In East Africa, with this thing we are calling cash for prayers, where, we sow a seed, then you're going to get a prayer. If you sow a small seed,
big prayer.
You get a small prayer. Big seed,
get a big prayer.
Get a big prayer and get a big breakthrough.
Yeah.
To be very honest, that is that has happened for a long time.
Very insightful.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure people listening don't know this.
Yeah. And so, it's even in the New Testament.
Yes.
Because Paul himself, Paul the apostle, not the one I'm looking at.
Not the one talking to you. Yeah.
Paul the apostle said there are some people who do this stuff because of money.
Yeah.
So this is right from the beginning. One of the big arguments for the launch of the Protestant church was cash for prayers.
Yeah.
People were paying money so that they could be prayed for to spend less time in purgatory.
Right.
So this is with a denomination, the denomination that we would call kind of like the rock, the longest lasting denomination.
Yes.
And the one that is most orthodox, the one that is most, kind of faithful to historic doctrine, if you can call it that. So that's footnote number one. And then footnote number two is that there's always a tendency to think, especially for those of us who are on the continent, and sometimes this influence comes from outside of the continent, to think that heresy is only one way. Heresy is only, let's say, some of the things that we're talking about. Heresy is that God, God heals people in this day and age, and that kind of, the kind of fake miracles and stuff. But then, the opposite heresy is true in other places where, God doesn't heal; it's the doctors who do it.
Yeah. That is also
also a heresy
that is not spoken of at all.
That is not spoken of and not criticized.
Not criticized, yeah.
Or not called out, because some of these, if we're going to call ourselves Christians, then I think it's good, for us to apply the standard. If we do say God is all knowing, He's all powerful,
right?
And on the one side, some people would be doing this. It's important to come and ask the question, if God is indeed all powerful, all knowing, then we can't, exclude Him from the chain of healing, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it is to say, heresies are there everywhere. And then now to the main points.
Yeah.
Once we get that out of the way, to the main points. I think, and I'll just talk about maybe a couple, and one of them is the over reliance of the understanding that God will intervene in your circumstances, and sometimes to the extent that the preacher, the preacher derives financial gain from your desire for God to intervene.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the main criticisms of the prosperity gospel, where the pastor is gaining, from the people's need and the people's desire, for a better life, the desire for, to get out of the rut that they're in, to be able to deal in their own personal lives with issues that are really systemic issues.
Yeah.
You know, some of the poverty that, in fact, a good bit of the poverty you find on the continent is not because of evil spirits.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah.
It's
largely systemic.
It's
right?
systemic.
Yeah.
It's systemic. And so even as we cast out demons of poverty on the
That's
individual,
right. Yeah.
I suppose there could be spiritual, ways that people see themselves that kind of chain them to poverty and so on. There's some bigger demons. In fact, those are like principalities that need to be cast out using your vote.
Using your vote, yeah. Right.
So I don't think it's one or the other, but I think it's both and.
Yeah.
And I think in this discourse, I think it's important. That's one of the heresies.
Right.
And those are the dimensions of it.
Yeah.
Since we are talking about principalities at a national level.
National principalities.
Yeah. There are some things that can only come out by prayer and fasting, but then there are others that come out by prayer, fasting, and then you go cast your vote, or you go do something about it in the government
advocate
office,
or something.
And there's that. And we are seeing a growing number of Pentecostal leaders and Pentecostals getting into that space.
I agree with you.
And saying, no, we want something different for ourselves.
Yeah.
And I've seen some wonderful, examples in different parts of Africa where Pentecostals say, well, fine, I might not agree with this particular person, but we are for the same thing.
Yeah.
And they'll come in and advocate for policies. I see it at the grassroots level. In the place where I lived in Nairobi, there'll be Christians in the local area, what I'm going to say, like the local area council, and they're advocating, we want, a better water system, want a better sewer system. There are Pentecostals, prominent Pentecostals, working with the motorcycle transport guys, kind of organizing them and making sure, they're doing their insurance and those kinds of things.
That's right.
And, there are others who are, doing care. So it's happening at the grassroots level. It needs to happen a lot more.
Yeah.
There is a flip side though. In several countries in Africa, we began to see, kind of Pentecostal churches and leaders kind of wanting to wield power and kind of interacting with the government, being less critical of governments that support them.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that. We see in East Africa, we see in Southern Africa.
It's in West Africa, I can confirm.
So again, that's another whole thing. When the Pentecostal churches are large enough or the movement is big enough and can wield power, in South America, we see a bit of that. What then happens when, does the church then lose its voice to be able to speak? Truth to power. So those are some of the things that we see. So yes, there's heresy, there's moral failure with the leaders, there's financial issues with the people. There's the problems with the preaching. For many of them, some of the leaders are not trained. Some of them, are not fully aware of Christian history or ecclesiology or doctrine. And you find that their sermons kind of color around the edges a little bit, and there's all of that. But I'm going to kind of put, a conclusion here and say, one of the things to understand about the Christian faith is that it is a human phenomenon.
Indeed.
And human beings, so long as any institution, church included, is led by or involves Christians, human beings, then you'll find much room for error.
Yeah.
And so even systems that, whether they're governance system or whatever this, involves human beings,
right,
will have error, potential for error.
Right.
But as a teacher of church history, I have seen that in the 2,000 years that we have of Christian history, it seems to me that Christianity somehow has found a way of maintaining, keeping the train on the rails.
Yeah.
And so there's always a coming back to orthodoxy, you know, renewal movements. If it goes so far out, either renewal movements break out and the core group, you know, kind of stays on the rails of doctrine.
Yeah.
And that is a unique thing.
Right.
It's a unique thing, so that the thing that we call Christianity is very diverse. What tends to happen is that the movements that kind of splinter off and go to, you know, different directions tend to die off.
Yeah.
You know, in just a few generations.
Right.
The ones that are based on just individuals and not really, you know, the core tenets of Christianity tend to die off.
Right.
This thing that we call Christianity keeps moving within history towards, I suppose, the end that Saint Augustine was talking about. So, yeah.
Wow, that's a really good conclusion, because it's like, I shouldn't say anything more, because like that's it. That's like the final word.
Well, we can say something more.
But I do have, and I'm gonna say it because I you know, you pointed out a number of very, very good things. One of which leads me to another sort of criticism. And with this conclusion, I don't know if we should talk about criticism, but yeah, we can talk about it.
We can talk about it.
Which is, which is like the emphasis on, like individual self piety, like me, my faith, my relationship with God, the way we talk about salvation in Pentecostal movements and Pentecostal churches. It's like it is a personal relationship with God, know God for yourself. You know, there's this emphasis on heaven and hell, you know, that kind of thing. And the world is not where we are called to. We are sort of called to like a life that is bigger than ourselves, and that life is in heaven. And I can imagine all these passages in the Bible as I'm speaking, versus this outward ministry towards the marketplace, social reforms. We talked a little bit about that too in your submission. And people are asking, okay, so what is the role of the Pentecostal church in society? What's the role? Is it that the only thing we can offer when society is calling for a reform be prayer? Should that thing be only prayer? Should it be only fasting? Should it be only like a revival meeting? Or, you know, there were issues in Ghana, for example, when the CD was depreciating so terribly. And a very famous, you know, well-respected man of God called for prayer for the CD, right? Which in that cosmology makes sense to a lot of people. But also, people were asking, okay, is the only thing that we can offer as a church prayer, right? Can we do something more? Can we influence the economy in a different way? Can we advocate a little bit more? Can we build more hospitals? Can we build, you know, like the social function of the church? Right? That's one of the things that I feel like a lot of people would like to know about. And I'm very glad that you mentioned that at the grassroots level, it seems like there's evidence that there are people speaking to that. So, you know, maybe speak a little more to that. The previous conclusion was great, but I couldn't let this go.
I think, and I think it's an important question. It's an important question. I think the language of conversion used even in Pentecostal churches, I think that language of conversion might, and this is something that has been coming a bit more clear to me in recent research that I've been involved in.
True, right.
And I'm finding that. So first of all, you know, at a broad level, the language of conversion that we use has been influenced in some senses by I'm going to say like evangelical discourse. So, you know, Jesus, my personal savior. I think that's what we normally say in East Africa. I don't know how they say.
It's the same thing. That's the sinner's prayer.
Yeah,
and it has that language.
Yeah. It has that language. But when you look at how people live out that conversion, they kind of live their faith within a community. And so for many of these churches, it is a community. Complete with mom and dad, you know, papa, you know,
aunties and cousins,
aunties and cousins. So in that sense, you know, the community sees itself as a family. Many of the churches see themselves as family. The senior pastor and his wife, you know, are like their parents. And you know, then everyone is brother and sister in the thing. So there is a certain element of community. Community life that speaks to the question that you're saying in terms of personal piety. Just this last week, we listened to a sermon or a series of sermons in a church service, and they were talking about, you know, your own life and your you know, God's blessing on you. Is there so that it can have an impact on the people around you. So your blessing is also the blessing for your family, is a blessing for the people around you. So there is a certain element of communality that comes out. It doesn't feature in the in the language of conversion, but it is a lived out. That's an element of lived out faith. But still, the point that you're making is an important one, in the sense, is there enough? And I think the question you're asking is there enough of an emphasis on social change as opposed to personal piety? I think that's an area that has been, as Christianity, you know, Andrew Walls would say, Christianity is constantly translating itself, and as society changes, Christianity also needs to retranslate itself into the new thing that society becomes.
I like that.
And so society, as it is constructed in Africa today, is a little different than it was, much more different than it was 50 years ago. So today, I'm seeing that the retranslation is now beginning, where we are seeing, you know, conversation about social change, you know, political engagement, and those kinds of things. So for example, you find in a number of churches now, you're going to see the preachers also talk about, you know, there's a drive for people to go and vote. So in these Pentecostal churches, yes, we're going to pray, we'll do, you know, Kesha or overnight, in East Africa, we call it Kesha, in a place we call overnight prayer vigil. We're going to do all of that stuff. But as we're doing that stuff, you know, wake up tomorrow and
get out and
vote. And some people will say, well, we normally do, you know, vigil on this particular day, but we're not going to do this vigil on this day, so you can wake up early and go
and vote.
and vote. So there is that kind of thing.
Impressive.
And we've seen, you know, in East Africa, we've seen initiatives to kind of bring people together when there's ethnic violence, you know, Pentecostal initiatives to bring people together. So there's that going on. But I think we should also give credit where it is due, because we're now seeing, for example, in the last 20 to 30 years, we're seeing, you know, Pentecostal movements beginning to take up issues like education. So, you know, Nigeria, I imagine Ghana as well might have started, where you have Pentecostal universities. So they're entering into academia, a movement that was previously known to be anti-intellectual, you know, now producing universities. Some of them in Nigeria are leading universities with theology departments, but also other areas that are actually, conducting research and so on. Same thing in Eastern Africa and so on. You know, in Kenya, we have, you know, two, you know, major institutions that are affiliated with Pentecostal denominations. So I think those are we're beginning to see those kinds of things, and now thought leaders coming out of that. Another area that Pentecostals are very, very involved in, especially in Eastern Africa, I don't know very much about some of the other places. In Eastern Africa, a lot of Pentecostal pastors have children's homes.
Yeah.
And that's to deal with some of the issues that we have seen in the past, urban centers, problems in the urban centers, abject poverty in the rural areas. Yeah. And in some places, the HIV pandemic, when there was a lot of children just left destitute. Many of the people who founded children's homes were Pentecostal pastors,
right?
And just drawn out of their conviction that we need to do something in society, concerning some of these things. So I think we need to give credit where it's due. It's true, there has been a leaning on personal piety, but I think there's a retranslation that has been going on quietly and slowly in education, in some of these other places. It needs to be more, but you can see that there are certain ways in which that is beginning to happen. And I think we should be, continue to interrogate that whole language of, Jesus, my personal savior. There is I think there's a place where that needs to be retranslated into what we are now seeing. And I've had a few people, gone to a few services in different churches where now, for example, the perspective of making a decision for Christ is welcome to the family.
Oh, nice.
So I've been to a number of churches where I've had that language to the point where I think that retranslation might also be beginning, to happen as far as that's concerned.
That's very insightful and eye-opening, because I think that's a perspective that many people don't see, because they see the ones on the street and they criticize that. But there's also this other movement of people doing something. Of course, not on a larger scale as it should be yet. But there's some work and some new perspective out there. Right. Let's be wrapping up here. So I have two questions. The last one will be about resources, because you mentioned Andrew Walls a lot. You mentioned Lamin Sane to your book, of course, and your own work. So we'll end with that by suggesting some resources that people can look at. But before that, I guess it's a good thing, starting from origins, to think about future. Right. So what do you think is the future of the Pentecostal movement on the continent?
So I've had different conversations with people. There's some people who think that this thing is it's mostly personality cults and it will die out. It's
At some point, I sort of bought into that, but
I've had that. This thing is gonna die out, and so that's one perspective. Another perspective, I suppose, from within is that this thing is of God. It will last forever.
Right.
I think the answer, I have two thoughts around that, and maybe a verse.
I would appreciate that.
So I think on the one hand, it is true. The elements of the movements or elements of the Pentecostal movement that are based on individuals to sustain them, and that do not develop an ecclesial structure, will die. It happens even within denominations. If they don't have any ability to sustain themselves, in terms of leadership, polity, those kinds of things. So there's a good number that will not be there next year. In fact, the pandemic actually kind of decimated.
It took a lot of people out.
Like some of the smaller churches and so on, especially the ones that were really on shaky ground. Some of the ones that will have very wild theology and become completely detached from orthodox doctrine will disappear.
Yeah.
That's what church history teaches me.
That's right.
But movements that just don't connect themselves to the core tenets of what Christianity really is, eventually die out. That's what I've seen.
Right.
When you look at 2,000 years.
Yeah.
Now, maybe there's a movement that will kind of detach itself and, but the evidence, the historical evidence is if it gets too wild,
yes,
it
just dies off.
It dies off. So, but I think in terms of the cosmology, Pentecostal movements and Pentecostal way of thinking about Christianity will, really connect with African cosmology.
Yeah.
And in my view, I would expect that, Pentecostal expressions of Christianity will be with us for the foreseeable future.
Right.
Because African worldview or African way of seeing the world and African ways of understanding the oral epistemology, those are not going to go.
Yes.
They're not going to convert into something else.
True.
It will be like Africa's epistemological story, intellectual history. It's kind of, how the place is. And so long as Pentecostalism continues to be able to incarnate Christianity into that worldview, into that epistemology, is going to be there. So I think there'll be some movements that will die out in my lifetime, but I think we're going to be seeing Pentecostal Christianity, for decades, maybe even centuries.
Yeah.
The second reason why it's likely to stay is that for some denominations whose liturgical styles and I'm going to say like theological history is very different from Africa's.
Right.
Pentecostal way of thinking, Pentecostal way of being church will be the lifeline for those churches.
Yes.
That is what will that is what will sustain those churches.
You are so right. Yeah.
I have seen that in Eastern Africa with the East Africa revival. There are some denominations that would not have tided over. They would not have come through into this century.
Yeah.
But the East Africa revival and similar revivals around Africa that were able to reinterpret Christianity with the local languages, with the local idiom, were able to kind of save those denominations.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I think Pentecostal spirituality might be the savior of some of the denominations that otherwise have no chance within an African cosmology. So I expect to see Pentecostal spirituality. It might morph to what I don't know, but we're likely to see what we're seeing now for a while.
Sure. Wow. That's a historian who is also an anthropologist and an ethnographer, somebody who learns about people by observing.
Here's the verse for you.
Yeah, tell me.
Here's the verse for you. In the New Testament, when there was a controversy about the Christian movement and all of that, and Jesus and Christ, one wise man of God, I think it was Gamaliel, who said, leave this movement alone. If it is of God, we will not be able to do anything against it, and in fact, we'll be opposing God Himself.
That's right. Yeah.
So, so I think taking a theological perspective, whatever is not of God will will fall by the wayside.
Fantastic. Okay, so great. So, let's wrap up here by, sharing some resources, maybe books, website, authors, people, start with yourself, some of the things that you've done and where people can find it.
So I've read a number of papers and things. Some of those are available online. The book I wrote, A Spirit of Revitalization, is a history, a 100-year history of Pentecostalism in Kenya, which is in Eastern Africa. So that's something. And what I've done, I've explained, kind of like the different movements and, when they started, what are some of the things that motivated them and why they are the way they are, and how this Pentecostalism begins to take root. And I've talked about some of the things, we talked about here in the book, some of the engagement, social engagement, so on. I talked about some of the ways that is happening. There are other resources, other authors. West Africa, we have two important people. If you find any book on Pentecostalism by Kwabena Samoa Jadu, that's he's written several books, very, very, very important. Nimi Wariboko has a good one on Nigerian Pentecostalism. Let's go to Southern Africa. Alan Anderson, foremost scholar on Pentecostalism and Pentecostalism in Africa. Very, he's an expert in early movements, what I'm calling early African initiatives in Christianity. He's really good at that, and he's able to kind of one of the first ones that I read who connected the dots between those movements and Pentecostalism today. So he's a good one. Alan Anderson, again, a couple of books, like 2-3 books over there. Let's look at another East African, Wanjiro Gitao, has a book on Pentecostalism as it happens now, and has looked at millennials and Pentecostalism.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting one.
So she has a good book. What is it called? It's called Mega Church Reconsidered. That's a good book. If you're looking at conversations about the broad themes that we are talking about, Andrew Walls has 3 books. There's a 4th one coming out end of 2023. I can't wait for it. And so he explores some of these conversations, and he's a historian, and has done a really good job of being able to conceptualize the idea of translation, which previously it encompasses themes that previously were used by African theologians of the previous generations, ideas of inculturation, indigenization, and contextualization. So they Andrew Walls talks about translation. There is the classic Lamin Sane book. Translating the Message, very, very important book in terms of this kind of conversations. So that goes hand in hand with Andrew Walls. He had another book whose religion is Christianity. It's a good one. It does like a question and answer, kind of engagement. There are other themes in this conversation that are important for one, and I'm going to give you a couple of important authors. One of them is Jehu Hansils. He has a book on migration and making of Christianity. That's a recent book, came out last year or year before last. Again, it looks at this conversation broadly and engages some of these themes, not just from an African perspective, but broadly. But then there's a very important thing we haven't talked about today: African Pentecostalism outside Africa. Diaspora Christianity.
Diaspora Christianity.
That's absolutely, it's a huge topic. Can't even begin to even comment on it right now. Afe Dogame, very important voice in that conversation, and also generally Pentecostalism in Africa as well. There are other voices emerging. Other people. I think one I can think of right now is Bimbola de la Kun, who looking at certain aspects. Someone else, Victor Ezibo, as well, who's looking at theological aspects. Adelakun looks at performance, practices within African Pentecostalism. So there are those. There are historical books. Grant, forget what his first name is, but there's a good book by on Ghanaian Pentecostalism.
I see. Nice.
By Grant, I forget what the first name. Anyway, you find it.
Yeah.
Baylor University Press. It's a good book.
Nice.
And kind of explore some of those conversations as well.
Great.
Yeah.
That's like a tall list of things. This is your bibliography for you already.
Yeah. It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. This has been a really, really, really good conversation. Provided great perspective on different things. And I'm sure listeners are going to learn a lot from you and from what you've written, but also from a lot of the suggestions that you've made, in addition to the content you've provided on this podcast. So thank you very much, Dr. Mugambi.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, say it.
If there's a listener who has a passion, or maybe you have a dual call or something,
yes,
and you want to research this thing, the story hasn't been fully told. So
nice.
Get out there, write something, do your masters.
Yes, do your masters.
You've done your master, do your PhD and study these things, but study it, and dignify what needs to be dignified.
That's right.
Call out what needs to be called out.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. That's a good call, right? Yeah. That's really good. I can imagine. I'm going to send this out personally to some of my friends who are doing this at Akofi. So I'm sure they will take it up and work on that. Thank you very much, Dr. Mugambi. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate your time, your insight, your experience, and your sharing so generously. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.